Welcome to the Center for Climate and Security's Climate and Security podcast. I am your host, Dr. Shatha Chakraborty. Regular listeners will know that twice a month, we bring to you the leading thinkers, educators, civil servants, and military personnel who work at the nexus of climate and security. I ask these experts to share with us their views and perspectives of how we can really prepare in this time of high consequence risk, particularly that of climate change. Today's podcast guest is retired Brigadier General Gerald Galloway. General Galloway is a distinguished member of the Center for Climate and Security's Advisory Board, as well as a professor of engineering at the University of Maryland, College Park, and a visiting professor at Texas A&M, where he focuses on water resources policy and management. This is all after a 38-year-long career in the U.S. Army, as well as additional years in the federal government, including as a presidential appointee to the Mississippi River Commission. He is currently serving as chairman of the board of a San Francisco-based NGO currently examining sustainable hydroelectric power production in the Mekong River Basin in Southeast Asia. The list of honors and accolades is a long one, as you all can imagine. Gerry, thank you for your incredible career and service, and thank you for joining me today on the podcast.
My pleasure. It's great to be here and to get a chance to talk about subjects that you and I both know are very important.
Absolutely. So let's delve right into it. Why are these subjects so important? What are the risks that really concern you and that keep you up at night?
Well, many things keep me up at night. It's really amazing the world in which we live. First of all, don't watch television before you go to bed. But what keeps me up at night in the field we're talking about are the issues of climate change itself, the issue of natural disasters, the challenges that we face in dealing with floods, which are a special part of natural disasters, and national security itself. And I'll toss another one in, natural security.
Okay, what is natural security?
Natural security is how we treat the environment and how mistreatment of the environment can harm us. And that's tied back to national security. They work very closely together. A number of NGOs that are in the natural resources field are worried about this issue of natural security. If in fact we are causing disruption in communities overseas, entire countries are set back because they don't have the resources to feed their people, because their natural resources, meaning the animals that are there, are being poached and carried away, they're going downhill. That creates an instability, which in turn creates tensions, which in turn puts us likely to have a conflict, or at least susceptible to conflict. So we want the two. We want an environment that's rich, and at the same time we want the people that live there to have live with the fruits of their particular land.
So is this a term that has been really relevant in the work that you're doing currently?
Yes, I'm certainly working in the Mekong River. And the issues there are, how do you take a river as big as the Mekong, beginning in the Himalayas and running all the way to the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, that services the countries of China and Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Thailand, and Vietnam, has all of those trying to work together with this one common resource. At the top, the Chinese have built dams that are taking care of holding 50% of the sediment that would normally flow down. They're in control, really, of how much water comes down. The other countries have to share. What do they need? They need the ability to produce power to sell it, because they're very poor countries, and that means you want to build dams on the river. But the dams are also interference with the natural process, the fish that need to move up, the sediment that needs to move down. So how do you balance all of those things? And we've spent the last 5 years trying to figure out how you could support the building of hydroelectric facilities and the power so that the people could have an economic future, at the same time do it in a manner that it's not going to cause irreparable damage. And we just saw the other day the collapse of the dam in Laos, the loss of life, the destruction of property. So you have to worry about doing it right when you do it. And we've come up with a very interesting new idea, the idea of solar power for dams. Have you ever heard of that?
No, please tell me more.
The idea is you have a dam. If you build this dam and you generate hydroelectric power, it creates a large reservoir behind it. I need to get more power, so I'll build another dam. No, what if I took barges and put solar panels on those barges and floated them on the dam I just finished? The fish like it. It gives shadows to them. It gives them breeding grounds. It is cheap. It is immediate. You don't have to wait 5 years till the dam is built. You don't relocate anybody because all the relocation's already been done. And this is the thing that the governments of Laos and Cambodia are considering. Certainly China is big into this. The UK has done it. It's a new way of thinking, and it's a new way of trying to recognize you need to accept that the economic growth is going to occur. We've got to do it in a way that helps everybody.
Wow, that's fantastic to hear. How innovative. These seem like the solutions that really could solve some of these issues.
Well, it really is. We haven't thought about a number of these things, and it's interesting going back to the balance between national security and natural security. Again, if we build dams that cut off the fisheries, you're going to have millions of people that will not be able to survive. If we hold the sediment behind all of these dams, then the Mekong Delta at the far end of the river will not get the sediment that it's normally been given that creates the delta. You know, we grow all our deltas, whether it's the Nile or the Louisiana, Mississippi Delta, we grow those with that sediment. If it's not there, at the same time we have sea level rise, we're going to lose the rice fields of the Mekong. And that's a tremendous asset for Southeast Asia. So we've got to be watchful of all of these and be aware of what's going on. So I worry at night, do people recognize the challenges we have? Do they recognize what climate change really means? Do they recognize what natural disasters are? And do they recognize how those two influence the other two, national security and natural security?
Sure. Thank you for kicking this off with the solutions first and foremost, because that's really ultimately what we need to be focusing our time and our resources on, and collectively bringing in people like yourself who've really worked at that cross-section of academia and then security, practical application. That is really where we're going to find that combined knowledge to address these major challenges that are coming up. Can we scale this solution you suggested? Is there potential there for that? What other types of innovations are you seeing?
Well, I think the issues are, how are we going to deal with the impacts of climate change in the long run in the fields that I worry about? I worry about natural disasters and the effect that climate change has on those natural disasters. First of all, I'm worried that people have their eyes closed, or their fingers in their ears, or their head in the sand. They don't want to worry about it. It's unpleasant. They don't want to argue about it. So they just dismiss the idea of climate change. Yet we know, you just look around this country, the number of billion-dollar disasters we've had, the billion-dollar disasters we've had in so many other places in the world in the last decade. It is amazing. They're happening. We can't get away from it. Now, people will say, well, this is just a ripple, it's a cyclical, and this is going to go away. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we better start worrying about it now, because it's on our plate right now. And whether it's 30 years, 100 years, or 1,000 years, we've got to deal with it, because we cannot continue to have these disastrous events, natural disasters that occur. Harvey was a natural event. Mississippi River floods are natural events. What's unnatural is the fact that people are destroyed by them. We lose lives. So we're not preparing because we don't understand what the threat is. We don't understand that risk. We don't develop that risk and come up with strategies to deal with it. And that's very, very important here domestically. If you can't move goods across the country because the bridges are out, or the roads or the highways are shut down, then you have a problem. And our national security is impacted by that. So we'd better recognize that we need to do something about it. Nowhere is that probably more evident than at sea level rise on the east coast of the United States. As we know, the Center for Climate and Security did this wonderful book on sea level rise in the U.S. military mission. And it talks about all of the challenges that our many bases on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast have in surviving sea level rise. What's a little sea level rise? Well, it's big. It really is big, and we need to be prepared. We need to start now to thinking about something that needs to be built and ready in 10 or 15 years, or in the case of Norfolk, Hampton Roads, our major port area down there, our major military installations, tomorrow. I mean, they are getting more and more flooding. And the other thing that people sometimes forget is that the military talks a lot about this. They're at the point. They're doing the research. They're looking out and finding out what's going on. But they're also tied just like this to the local community. And if the local community is underwater, if the workers can't get on the base to help, if the people that live off post can't get off post because of that, it's a major problem. And on a national scale, it's affecting the poorer people in our country. And so we need to be thinking about this in each of these installation areas, but we ought to expand it to thinking about it across the nation.
What have been the biggest challenges in really getting that message across? Why do people have their fingers in their ear?
I'm sorry, I'm too busy. I've got other things on my mind. I'm worried about a political issue of the day. I'm worried about an election that's forthcoming. I'm worried about the tax base in my country. I've been working on a National Academy study on resilience, the ability of a community to bounce back after a natural disaster. We've met mayors and city council members, and they're all for it when you talk to them about it. But they say to me, look, I have poverty in my community. That's first. I've got to take care of that. Or my infrastructure is terrible. I'm a Flint, Michigan, and the water supply system is terrible. The sewer systems are in rough shape. We're working on a study of urban flooding. That's flooding that occurs when the rainfall hits and there's no way to move the water off. How come Constitution Avenue was under 3 feet of water in 2006 from rainfall alone? We've got areas in Washington, D.C. that are the same way. We are not recognizing this, and so people who are there are focusing on the immediate problems they have and not thinking in a broader way. What they need to do is recognize that the same thing is happening all over the world. And from the national security standpoint, when you have these impacts of climate change, they are putting the people in those countries, whether it be Bangladesh or one of the Stans or somewhere else, we're putting them in a situation where they are going to have unrest, instability, and they become a catalyst for conflict. Climate change, the absence of the resources you need, cause farmers to leave the fields and come into the cities. And we've seen in our own country, the problem is when we overcrowd the cities. We've got to have the resources there, and we've got to think these things through. So it is to our advantage to work as a collective in the world on reducing the impacts of climate change, reducing climate change to start with, but doing something to prevent these instabilities from occurring and helping our allies and friends deal with them when they do occur. At the same time, you are looking to the United States military to be ready to fight anywhere, anybody. And guess what? The world is changing. Seas are higher. Distances seem to be longer when you don't have the resources to move the supplies. When we have a Pacific orientation, it's not flying across the Atlantic, it's going all the way to the other side of the Pacific Ocean, and that's very difficult. Our ships probably need to be redesigned. All those military installations in the United States need to be examined. They need to decide what needs to be done. And the Congress last year gave the military that responsibility. Tell us where the risks are. The military is leading the country in doing this. The big cities can do it. We've got 19,000 incorporated areas in this country. New York City and New Orleans, they've got resilience officers. But I won't tell you the names of the towns, but the towns in Iowa and Illinois and Arkansas, they don't have those resources. They're very small. And how are we going to help them get through? So we need to be working together as a team, the military and the civilians, to recognize that we need to be ready for the changes that are occurring all around us.
So what are you seeing as successful measures in changing that approach of I'm too busy and a lack of prioritizing all of these various risks that you've outlined for our listeners? How do we actually communicate that and make it a higher priority?
Well, it comes down to one thing: leadership. You need to have leaders who are well educated and a public that is following and not following them blindly, leadership that listens to the people. The people are learning as they go along. People have said, what would you tell people to do? It's like my students. Know and understand the challenges you're going to face. Don't turn off the show. They're telling you about the impacts of sea level rise. They're telling you about there's some problem with more storms and we're not able to figure it out. Oh, no, I don't want to listen to that. Listen to it. Become educated, and then go to public meetings and say to your congressman or your city council member, how are we preparing to deal with this particular challenge? And it's a challenge that is not only economic, it's social, and it's a national security challenge. So what are you doing about it, and what can we do to help you? So everybody has to be involved, but we need leaders that are willing to do that. We've watched in this work we're doing in resilience, community resilience across the country, the communities where there is a strong force, a leader who says, I want my community to be ready if it gets knocked down to get up and be ready. We can't stop the hurricane, but we can be ready for it and we can be better prepared. The military has been doing this for some period of time. For the last decade, actually 2 decades when you look at it, they've been exploring what are the risks, what are we going to do about it, and then going to the Congress and saying, that we need to do something. And the center has been very active in talking about this and going to the Hill and saying, listen to us, you need to help them get where they want to go.
Right, and so really calling people to educate themselves, increase awareness. Those who are listening and maybe hearing this for the first time, we can encourage them to do that and take personal initiative. Those students that have the luck and the advantage of being able to have access to you, or those who are already working in the space, where do you see their opportunities in the future? Where would you encourage them to divert their time and attention and studies towards? Where can we really see advancement to address this vast scale of challenge?
Well, I'm not going to be a proselytizer. I think being a civil engineer is a wonderful thing. I'm a geographer also, and I love being that. But any profession needs to be worried about these sorts of things. The issues of climate change, the issues of dealing with national security are everybody's business. You have to be invested in it. Your community has to grow. And whether you're an engineer or a psychologist or a healthcare professional or you're working in a library, you have a vested interest in making sure these things are taken care of. So I tell the students, and I've taught the public policy students and taught engineering students, that you need to go out and be part of the solution. You need to take a role in it. If it's you're an engineer, you need to go to the public meeting and speak up. If you're a public policy, you need to ask tough questions of the engineers. Why isn't this working? One of the biggest challenges we have in this country is healthcare and housing. And everybody is involved with that. You can say, well, what about the arts? Even if you're in the arts, you are trying to protect them. I just finished a study. I was chairing a study for the government of Italy in the city of Florence about flooding in that city. In '66, a huge storm came through there and wiped out a number of the major artworks that were there, just totally destroyed them. And the worry is, what have we done in the last 50 years to do something about that? And what should we be doing now to make sure it doesn't happen again? Well, Machiavelli and Da Vinci both worked on this issue. So these things don't go away. And those were guys that were engineers of sorts, but they were also artists. And they recognized and appreciated that we cannot neglect the things that don't seem important every single day. But we do need to. And whether it's housing or whether it's healthcare or whether it's the arts and sciences, everybody's got a role to play.
That is so beautifully put. Everyone really does have a role to play, whether it's adjusting their behaviors, changing their decision-making regarding activities daily for their households. But it's more than just changing the light bulb, wouldn't you say? What do you really, when people ask you, as somebody who has worked in the space for as long as you have, what can I do? I'm just one person.
Well, you can be sure that your leaders are involved. I mean, you can't go out and change the balance we have among fuels in this country. But you can campaign for people to address that. You can identify what you've heard is a problem and demand that your leaders answer why they're doing what they're doing in response to that particular issue. Is fracking a four-letter word? Fracking, to many people, is an anathema. On the other hand, it is a very powerful way of getting resources. Talk about that in your community. The state of Pennsylvania put together an interdisciplinary group with natural resource agencies and NGOs and business all together, and they worked out a solution that seems to be reasonable. We'll see in the long run how well it works, but we need to get everybody into the game, and we need to require our leaders to address the issues, not stick their head in the sand.
So what about those folks in this country who are not necessarily, okay, so we've heard you, fine, we will go speak, but it's probably not anything that is going to impact us immediately. Those who live on the coast can deal with the flooding. That's not our problem necessarily. What do we say to those people?
Well, peel back the onion and see that it is your problem. Guess who pays for people who live in danger's way, people who build a mansion on the shores of a coastline that's going to erode? The National Flood Insurance Program is billions of dollars in debt, not because of mismanagement on their part, but because the Congress has protected over the years those people that were their constituents that lived in these hazardous areas and subsidized the way they were living. They're trying to stop that and they're trying to reform that. But that's just one example, that it does affect you, and you need to find out how all these things affect you. If in fact we take path A with fuels, what's that going to mean to you? If in fact we don't take care of clean air, what's that going to mean to you? And you need to find these things out, and again, be an active citizen, be actively involved. And in your organization, there isn't a company that ought not to be thinking about how resilient we are, how does climate change affect our particular company, and what are we going to do about it, and how can we help our employees? Are there things that they could do? Do we want to have places where we are recycling, we are doing the things that have proven so far to be useful?
So you mentioned in the beginning the hurricane season, and the cost of all of these impacts just in the United States alone is in the billions. This is astronomical. It's hard for a lot of humans to really comprehend, because of some cognitive limitations we all share regardless, what that number means. How do we begin to illustrate and explain to them the astronomical cost of these impacts if we don't act now? And how do we begin to address this cost? It's going to stack up, it sounds like.
It certainly is. And I wish I had a good answer for you. What you do, my granddaughter had her friend with a drone this weekend, and she was flying the drone over the neighborhood. And you begin to see what the neighborhood looks like. Well, I would suggest that what we need to do is have people fly over Puerto Rico and see what happened and what a disaster can mean. Yes, the dollars are tremendously important, and we need to worry about that. But to disrupt the lives of so many people, go to Houston. I'm working at Texas A&M, and I spend a lot of time in Houston. And there are areas in the city that are not yet back on their feet. You drive down a street, and we're almost a year, a few weeks before a year since Harvey occurred, and there's still trash in the street. They're still piling up as they clean these houses out. And there are some places where they haven't gotten around to clean them out. People who were flooded by ditches still have ditches. The idea of replacing these with a sewer system, stormwater, isn't going to happen. There just isn't enough resources. So as you spend more and you lose more, then you have less to work with, and it's going to become tighter and tighter. And so one of the things we have to do, and it becomes important to everybody, is recognize that we all have a role in reducing the risk we're taking. You know, don't build in the floodplain. When you build a new house, have a safe room in it so that when a tornado comes, you and your family can hide. You know that and this is off the climate change, other than in the tornado business, the cost of a granite counter is more than that of a safe room. Yet your family's risk is very great without that safe room. And how about schools? When you build a new school, are you requiring? Charleston, South Carolina faces a major problem from hurricanes, that we know that. They have sea level rise, and it's already affecting the Battery, the most beautiful historic part. But they're also probably the site of the third largest earthquake that we've had in this country. And they just went through, at great expense, retrofitting their schools to be seismically protected. Are people willing to do that? They have to wake up to what the challenges are, but that means they need to not close their eyes to what's out there, identify what the challenges are, and go back to that, identify the risk, assess what you can do about it, come up with a strategy, and then get to work. Because too many times you'll see that 5 years ago, here's a plan. There are tons of reports that say do this, this, and this. And you need, New York was blessed to have Mayor Bloomberg. He was there when Sandy hit, and he said, let's go at it. And he put things to work, and he started programs. Now, how long those will last, only the new leadership will be able to tell. And we see that in many, many countries.
From your time as a presidential appointee and the work you did with the Mississippi River, what is still, do you see, relevant in terms of the work that you're applying and doing now in East Asia? What have you learned that can be scaled and that can be applied to other situations?
Well, I think all of the major river basins of the world are working together. We have a Mississippi River Commission that you mentioned. There is a Mekong River Commission, MRC, and they are close, and they're trying to share the ideas. People just don't understand that we're losing Louisiana every day. The coast is eroding, and we've got to do something to stop that. The old sediment that used to come down the river and form the delta over the hundreds of millions of years isn't coming as much. We've put levees in there that keep the people safe, but keep the sediment from getting on the land in many places. We are working very hard, they are working very hard, to come up with solutions to that. So are the problems that I mentioned on the Mekong Delta, where we're trying to protect the rice crops that are down there. So we're sharing with these. The same thing happens in Africa. And so the sharing of knowledge is tremendously important. And I speak of professional organizations, whether they're American Society of Civil Engineers or it's American Water Resources, whatever and their international colleagues are working to make sure we share these ideas, we get them together. I'm going next month to China for a conference called the International Sponge City Conference. Now, what's a sponge city? I'll tell you the answer. China decided, after they've had some really major rainfall events, catastrophic rainfall events that have flooded the city, killed people, shut down the economy, put long-term burdens on the city, that they can't have that anymore. So their goal is, the president has said, our goal is by 2030 to have most of our cities sponge cities, where 70% of the rain that falls on the city stays in the city and is cleaned and reused there. We don't want it going into your basements. We don't want it going all over the city and drowning people. We want to have solutions. We want to have wetlands that are there. We want to have retention ponds. There are ways to do this, and they're out to prove it. By 2024, 8 big cities say they will be well on the way to doing that. So there are things that can be done if there's leadership and people are thinking about it.
So that's fantastic. I mean, that's another great example that you're providing that potentially could be really useful for, as observers, seeing how that goes, and then really applying it to particularly vulnerable places that could benefit from seeing some really be the early adopters for these solutions.
Well, we could start here at home, and we are, but there's the challenge. I mentioned before that Constitution Avenue flooded in 2006. It poured water into the lower parts of the Internal Revenue Service, and the building was shut down for 6 months. It put water
Some Americans might be happy about that.
Well, unfortunately, it didn't get the people that were after your money.
Oh.
But it also went into the new auditorium in the National Archives. Just imagine the National Archives. It went all along Constitution Avenue, kept many of the buildings down for a certain period of time. Not very good. It's going to cost a lot to take care of that. We have Bloomingdale here in the district, a small area that floods continuously. They're trying to do things with this, but it's going to take money. And so what we need to do is identify the problems, commit the money to it, and then go out and spend it and take care of it. We can't continue to ignore some of these challenges. And climate change and its relationship to national security and natural disasters is terribly important for us to understand.
Well, Gerry, you've come across as loud and clear. I mean, the urgency is very obvious here, hearing you speak about it. Are you optimistic about us meeting these challenges?
I am. Again, because I'm dealing with young people, they're raring to go. They just need to get some support, and what they need most of all is people not to shut the door on them, and that's they need to be able to walk into somebody's office and have a discussion. All too often, I think it's changing considerably, but all too often when we start this 10 years ago, you'd go in and say, let's talk a little bit about climate change. Oh, not that. You know, we don't talk politics and climate change. Well, we need to talk climate change for sure.
Absolutely, and thank you. What a great way to leave our listeners really motivated and optimistic about the future if we are able to really combine our forces and act now. Thank you so much. Let's absolutely do it. Thank you, Gerry.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Climate and Security Podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Please tweet me directly at SWETAC or the Center for Climate and Security's Twitter handle. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, write a review on iTunes, share widely, and finally, consider donating to the podcast from the Center of Climate and Security's podcast page, www.climateendsecurity.org/podcast, by clicking on Make a Donation. We will continue this series of conversations with the most prolific and dedicated folks in this space, and your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you, and please tune in again for the next episode of the Climate and Security Podcast.